Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome, and thank you for joining us today. I'm Shachar Sadeh, the Director of Adamah NY, and I'm so glad to see members of our Adamah NY community here today, folks from our Climate Coalition, our Jewish Green Business Network, synagogue partners, advisory council members, and so many others who are here to learn. For anyone who may be new to us, Adamah NY cultivates vibrant Jewish life in deep connection with the earth, bringing climate action, immersive Jewish environmental learning, and youth and college students empowerment through climate action, environmental education. We're doing it together across New York City, Westchester, and Long Island. At Adamah NY, our work is grounded in the belief that Jewish values call us to care for the earth and for one another. We do that by educating, empowering, and convening people across sectors, faith leaders, young people, environmental professionals, and community members, so that together we can better understand the challenges of our time and take meaningful action. We have many engagement opportunities for communities to come together outdoors, volunteering, and taking care of trees or open spaces to celebrate the holidays with nature connection in mind. We have a new Mitzvah program, so you can learn more about it. We'll drop the link to our website in the chat. And I would love to meet you all in person in one of our programs. Today, we're focused on climate action. Currently in New York, we are supporting 121 Jewish organizations in creating and implementing climate action plans by providing information, technical support, learning opportunities, matching grants, and zero interest loan of up to $250,000. This is especially relevant for those institutions who are contemplating solar. Part of our mission is also making sure we ourselves stay informed and curious and connected to the cutting-edge innovations shaping our climate and sustainability landscape. So today's conversation is a perfect example of exactly that. New York is navigating urgent questions around energy resilience, equity, and climate adaptation, questions that communities everywhere are grappling with. And climate action is about mitigation of carbon emission, and it is about lowering your electricity bill, but it is also connected to larger questions of affordability, resilience, and justice. For many of us on the call today, the question is, what do we do with that knowledge as a community? How do synagogues, schools, JCC, camps, and other Jewish institutions participate in shaping a more just, healthy, and resilient future? Jewish tradition gives us a language of responsibility. We are not separated from the world we inhabit. We are called to serve, protect, and repair it. So Jewish tradition asks us not only to care, but to act. It asks us to see responsibility as collective. And that is what makes this conversation so powerful. Jewish institutions are uniquely positioned to educate, to model, to convene, and to advocate. Today, we're excited to host Noah Ginsburg, the Executive Director of the New York Solar Energy Industry Association, NYSEIA, which is the state-only solar industry trade association. NYSEIA's mission is to accelerate the distributed solar and storage through advocacy, education, and coalition building, and we'll hear all about it in a minute. There's a famous phrase from Ecclesiastes, I'm sure I messed that up, that there's nothing new under the sun. So without getting into the philosophical issue around that sentence, I can say that in New York, there's so much new under the sun in advocacy and legislation and implementation of what NYSEIA calls solar deployment. And there are forces that support this blessed trend, and some, both on the federal and on the state level, that try to weaken it. And I'm sure Noah will refer to the state budget and what it entails for climate in general and solar in particular. And spoiler alert, it is not a black or white answer. This session will also explore the opportunities communities, institutions, and advocates have to help advance a more resilient, affordable, and sustainable future, our energy future. And this is why I'm so excited to learn from you and with you, Noah. So thank you for joining us and making the time to educate us. And before I move the mic to you, we will hear a presentation and then we'll have a lot of time for Q&A. For the time being, put your questions in the chat. And Noah, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Shafar. It's great to be here. Great to see you all. Just really inspired by the work of Adamah and happy to have a way to connect some elements of my personal and professional life here. Shahar already did a pretty great introduction of NYSEIA, so I won't bore you all with that. Um, well, I guess I'll say just a few more things about the association, but not too much more. So we're the trade group that represents the solar industry here in New York State. We have 230 member companies. These are the companies that are actually installing solar on rooftops, building community solar projects, building battery energy storage systems in New York, and then like an ecosystem of professional service providers who work with them. So law firms, finance companies, um, operations and maintenance companies, the groups that are actually like working to get projects built here in the state. We do a bunch of stuff, but a lot of it is focused on advocacy. So, on behalf of our members, we're trying to basically create conditions where we can build more solar and more storage in New York State faster and more cost effectively. So, we do that through both like legislative advocacy, which today is the last day of our legislative session in New York State. So, it's been a busy 6 months or 5 months, I guess. And then also regulatory work, which runs year round. We also do some work that's New York City specific, but a lot of it is focused on Albany. Just some stats about our solar and storage industry here in the state. So we've got a vibrant industry. It's almost 20,000 workers in the industry. That number has increased pretty much every year since we've been tracking it. More than 700 companies that are operating here in the state. And then almost 8 gigawatts of solar capacity up and running. And most people I appreciate don't think in watts or megawatts or gigawatts. So I'll explain it, in more normal numbers. We have enough solar in the state to power about 1.3 million homes, and it's about 5% of the electricity in the state. And that number's been growing every year. And actually, for the last 2 years, we built more than a gigawatt per year. So the pace of solar deployment is accelerating, which, from an environmental perspective, I find very hopeful. Um, and then energy storage is a little bit newer here in New York State. So energy storage is kind of like a peanut butter and chocolate or peanut butter and jelly situation where solar and storage pair really well together because solar is generating when the sun is shining. That energy can be stored in batteries and then dispatched when the grid needs it most, which today there's actually really good alignment where our peak solar production times coincides with when folks are running air conditioning and when we have a lot of commercial energy use. So there's good alignment in general. But with energy storage, it's something that you can really rely on, and then you can actually shift solar into the evening hours, which gets more and more important as we go from solar being rounding error to being our eventually primary energy source in the state. Um, there are a couple different ways that you can build solar, and I don't know if these pictures are the best ones to illustrate it actually, because they both are ground mount solar projects. But the difference here is that if you look at this solar array here, it's relatively small and it's right next to homes that are actually using that electricity. And so this is what a community solar project could look like. But you can also, of course, put solar on a rooftop, which is another form of distributed scale. And then there's utility scale projects like this one that are much, much bigger. They take up a much larger area. And typically, because of that, they're in remote locations. And then they rely on transmission lines to bring that clean electricity to where it's used. Um, NYSEIA represents the companies doing distributed scale, so rooftop and community solar. And just to give you a sense of how they're different, So rooftop solar and community solar directly lower customer energy bills. They can help reduce stress on the grid by generating power where it's consumed. It means that we're not having to put as much power through our transmission lines and through a distribution system, which can both relieve stress on the grid and save ratepayers a lot of money because we don't need to overbuild the electric system to serve a peak. And then they're integrated locally. So these are not remote resources that we're kind of piping in. It's integrated into communities, whether it's on the roof of a JCC, over a parking lot, on a private home, or in areas where there's more land available on an open parcel of land, but close into a community. Utility scale resources, they're bigger. Each project is much bigger. Um, so you can get kind of lower costs to build the projects in theory. They are really important for economy-wide decarbonization. Like we need to get carbon emissions out of our bulk power system, and building out large-scale renewables, whether it's offshore wind or utility-scale solar, is going to be really important for reducing our reliance on natural gas here in the state. And then it's kind of a system-wide integration. So they get integrated into the transmission system that gets then distributed kind of across the state. Um, while rooftop and community solar projects are smaller individually, they really do add up. And 93% of the solar that we have installed in New York State is rooftop and community solar, and only 7% is utility scale. I think I don't know exactly what the lesson is here. I think there are many lessons that we could learn from it, but what we've seen is that utility scale renewables in New York State has faced a number of challenges, and there have been setbacks where, like, disruption to global supply chain, inflation. The community scale and rooftop projects have been more able to navigate all of those changes and be a little bit more agile and get built despite those challenges. The utility scale projects have been um, we've been less successful getting them across the finish line in New York State. Um, so I'm definitely preaching to the choir on this one, but why this matters, and again, a lot of this is framed in kind of an affordability and economic context. Of course, from just a climate and air pollution perspective, we need to transition our grid to clean energy. There's no question about that. But even if we didn't care about public health, even if we didn't care about climate change, we should still be doing this because solar is now the cheapest source of electricity in the world. And as we've seen, our reliance on fossil fuels has a really severe economic cost. And it's not abstract. Everyone who's filled up a gas tank recently knows, everyone who's paid an energy bill recently knows that when there are global conflicts, uh, the price of fossil fuels go up. Um, with solar, that's not the case. You build it and the fuel is free, and it's locally generated. So I think it was Bill McKibben who coined this, but solar does not flow through the Strait of Hormuz, right? There's a lot of resiliency value in generating power locally, and even if panels are, predominantly manufactured in Asia, which, by the way, is starting to change. And under Biden era policies, we were getting a lot of growth in domestic manufacturing here in the States. The reality is that these are systems that are deployed locally, generate power locally, and leverage the resource that's falling on our rooftops and falling on our fields anyways. So again, just thinking about why energy costs feel really hard to control. And this is like the conversation in New York State. Maybe I'll put this in the context of the debate that's happened in New York over the last year around New York's climate law. So there's been a debate about, can New York afford to make good on its clean energy commitments, really kind of pitting clean energy on one side and affordability on the other. Um, we would argue that New York can't afford to not invest in clean energy because it genuinely is a lower cost solution. And energy costs for the first time in many, many years have become a kitchen table issue and an election issue where politicians are caring about this because people are thinking about their energy bills much more. Energy is non-discretionary. You can't just like choose to you could not run an air conditioner in the summer, and you can obviously conserve to some extent, but there are limits to that, right? Like you can't opt out of spending money on energy. And the costs of energy are driven by things that, for an individual consumer, really feel outside of your control, right? Like you can't control the what electricity costs on the wholesale market. You can't control when Con Edison is going to raise rates because they have to rebuild substations or whatever the case may be. And so a lot of this is there's a general feeling by consumers that they don't have control over their energy costs, but they're going up. Um, Then we've got federal policy, which has made these challenges that much harder. Last summer, the Trump administration, uh, in cahoots with Congress, ended federal support for solar power and for wind. The tax credits that have supported clean energy under both Democratic and Republican controlled Congresses and White Houses for the last 20, 30 years are now being phased out at really a critical moment that they should not be. On top of that, we have tariffs and trade actions that are adding new costs to building solar. And then we've got permitting actions that are stopping a lot of our larger, like offshore wind, as an example. The Trump administration is taking action to cancel projects. So what's happening is these federal actions are driving our energy prices up at a time when like we really do need that energy supply. And of course, it's not a secret that we have rising demand for electricity in this country and in this state from AI, from data centers, from electrification. So there are a lot of things that are going to be increasing demand for electricity. So just from an affordability perspective, it's really important that we get clean supply and cheap supply online quick. Unfortunately, New York has not been uniformly leading in the way that it should. At the same time that we were fighting last year, we were fighting to protect federal support for clean energy in Washington, D.C. We were blindsided by the New York State Public Service Commission, which cut $271 million of previously approved funding from the state's solar program. And that was kind of a shock and uh, forced us to really kind of refocus on Albany and say we can't take support for granted, even in a blue state. We need to make sure that we're continuing to make the case for why investing in solar power is a good investment. The Public Service Commission, in their defense, the way that they looked at it is they said, well, New York is ahead of schedule and under budget towards its distributed solar goal. So let's take the win and put the surplus funds into something else. So I understand the logic, but we do think it's short-sighted because that really is just an interim goal. And of course, if we zoom out and look at the bigger picture, we're really behind schedule on our overall clean energy goals. So doubling down on what's working is what we advocate for. And rooftop and community solar really is that thing that we're good at building here in the state. Um, I'm gonna jump past some of these. I'm used just very quickly. Solar is a really important affordability tool, both for individual households who are thinking about what they can do to take control over energy costs that feel outside of their control. Installing solar on the rooftop is a great example of something you can do that's going to really lower your bill. But also subscribing to a community solar project, which is something that you can do as a renter. It's something you can do without, if you don't have the financial means to purchase and install solar on a rooftop. And the exact same thing is true for community institutions. So whether it's a shul, a JCC, a church, a mosque, whatever the case may be, anyone can really install solar as a great way to reduce operating expenses. That's true at the micro level for an individual. Solar is a great way to lower an individual's cost by participating. But there are actually system-wide savings from building more solar in the state. Earlier this year, the solar industry worked with a consulting firm called Synapse Energy Economics that did an analysis of wholesale electricity prices in New York State. And they modeled different scenarios, one with business as usual, and one with an expanded build out of distributed solar to rooftop and community solar in the state. And what they found is that if we build more rooftop and community solar, 20 gigawatts of rooftop and community solar by 2035, which is a policy goal that NYSEIA is advocating for. If we achieve that goal, that's going to deliver $1 billion in annual utility bill savings to all ratepayers, like everyone who pays a bill. So there's the direct savings that an individual building or homeowner would get if they install solar or participate in a project. But again, just putting more solar on the grid is going to lower electric rates for everyone, is the big takeaway here. 20 gigawatts by 2035 is the goal that NYSEIA has been advocating for the last few years. We put out a roadmap a couple of years ago, basically making a case for raising our goal to 20 gigawatts by 2035, then outlining policy interventions that could help us get there in a really cost-effective way. There are a lot of benefits, of course, to continuing to invest in building solar in New York State. It creates good jobs, it reduces greenhouse gas emissions, reduced land use impacts. So if we're putting more solar onto the built environment and doing smaller scale installations that are closer to where electricity is consumed, that's going to be a significant benefit from a land use perspective as well. Um, Jumping past a few of these. Okay, so this is just like how it's actually been going if we just look at this just kind of like purely from a numbers perspective. So looking at this graph on the top, this is showing how much solar we've added per year. So you can see we've been increasing how much solar we add per year pretty consistently for the last decade. And then in 2024, there was a big jump and it's the first year that we installed more than 1 gigawatt in a single year. And then 2025, we again installed more than 1 gigawatt in a single year. And a lot of that growth is driven by community solar projects, which are a little bit bigger than like putting solar on a home or a business, but smaller than utility scale projects. And those projects can typically serve maybe it's 500 families, something to that effect, with a single installation. And that's proven to be a really effective and efficient way to build projects in the state. We are seeing a slowdown in new community solar development, and that's really for three main reasons. One is that the cost to interconnect or to plug new community solar projects in to the utility grid has gotten more and more expensive. So when a community solar project connects to the grid, the utility, you pay the utility does a study, they come back 3 months later and say, okay, if you want to plug in here, you have to pay $1 million. And if you want to move forward with your project, you pay the utility, they upgrade the local grid, and then you build your project and start generating power. That cost has increased fivefold in the last 5 years. So we've seen really the cost for the utilities to upgrade their systems to integrate solar going up and up and up and up. So that's a big challenge. And at the same time, the incentives have been decreasing both at the state and federal level. So those things are really squeezing projects. Then we also have challenges getting local land use approvals like permits to build projects. Um, so those have been some of the challenges. Another macro trend I'll mention is that 3, 4 years ago, the main focus was building solar in New York State. And between state policy changes and federal policy changes, there's been a shift where more and more companies are now focusing on building energy storage, which again is a good thing. And I actually think like a healthy evolution of the market that we're not just building solar, we're also building storage so that they can complement each other. So this is, I talked about this a little bit, some of like what's blocking this opportunity today. Well, for one, we're undervaluing solar energy in New York State. The way that solar is compensated for the value it provides to the grid in New York, it's based on how much it cost utilities to build traditional infrastructure like a decade ago. And we haven't updated that in a decade. Our Public Service Commission has been working on that for a long time. We hope they finally adopt updated rates because we just saw a study showing that the actual value that we're getting out of these solar and storage projects is 2 to 3 times higher than what they're being paid for in upstate New York when it comes to like basically the idea here is that if you build solar and storage locally, then you don't need to overbuild your electric transmission and distribution system. And so solar and storage projects get paid a little bit for avoiding those costs, but what they're getting paid is outdated. So updating that is going to be really important. The interconnection issue I already mentioned, but basically utilities are charging more and more every year to connect projects to the grid. Their costs are going up far faster than inflation, and there are good tools that we could use to manage those costs and get projects integrated faster and at a lower cost. Um, and then um, and then I guess this last point here about utility incentives. So the utilities are not incentivized to lower interconnection costs. They're not incentivized to get more distributed solar and storage onto the grid. They earn a profit from building traditional infrastructure. So, you know, solar and storage projects that eliminate the need for overbuilding the system could be viewed as a threat by the utility. I think that's changing a little bit, and that's not uniform. I definitely don't want to demonize the utilities. I think for the most part, they are just doing their jobs and trying to keep the lights on. But there are some very real challenges there, and we think some misaligned incentives that if we fix that, then we can really all be rowing in the same direction and investing in the system in a way that's smarter for the long term. Okay, so the Accelerate Solar for Affordable Power Act, this is the big policy proposal that NYSEIA was working on this legislative session and last legislative session, and did three things. This bill, let me see if I've got that here. Nope, I don't. Okay, I'll just tell you what's in it. What this bill was supposed to do was raise our distributed solar goal to 20 gigawatts by 2035, direct our Public Service Commission to better regulate the utilities and their costs, and advance smart reforms that are going to lower interconnection costs, so we can build projects faster and cheaper and leverage technology. Um, then the third thing was continuing the New York Sun program, which is the incentive program that supports rooftop and community solar in the state. And I want to just acknowledge, like, there were so many advocates and folks that came out and really went to bat for the ASAP Act over the last couple of years. It was really moving, honestly, to see environmental groups, environmental justice groups, labor, unions, all these different groups coming together with the clean energy industry to get this done with the legislature. We got the full thing, the full ASAP Act through the Senate. But then where we landed was a partial implementation of the ASAP Act in the budget. So the governor's office weakened certain provisions of it. And what we ended up with was a $200 million investment in our solar program. So that's largely replenishing what the Public Service Commission diverted in 2025. We got some interconnection reforms or some proceedings where we can lower the costs and accelerate timelines. And there's really three different types of interconnection reforms that were there. So again, we call this is a meaningful win. $200 million of funding with our current costs and everything else that can support about 1 gigawatt of solar capacity in the state, which is a lot. So that's great, and that gives some runway to solar companies. It's protective of the solar workforce because they'll have that continuity. They know that there's going to be continued state support at least for the next 18 months or so while we work through that funding allocation. And then the interconnection reforms, what we got, we didn't get very clear directives that are going to translate to lower costs. What we got is a directive from the legislature to our Public Service Commission to basically initiate proceedings where we're going to make progress on these things. And so what I would say, there's other stuff that we're working on statewide, but I don't want to go too deep into the weeds with all of that. I guess like the big picture message that I would say, like I didn't really talk about so much about the other things in the budget. I imagine most of the folks on this call know that part of the budget deal in New York State was also weakening certain provisions of New York's Climate Act, changing carbon accounting standards, pushing timelines out for implementing cap and invest. And obviously that's a negative news story from the perspective of reducing carbon emissions. But I think to Shahar's point, like the gray here is that it's not all bad. We did get some meaningful positive things done, like the investment in the New York Sun program. And I'm still very optimistic about the future for rooftop and community solar in New York State. So we have a lot of work still to do. But maybe I'll stop there and see if anyone has questions.
Thanks so much, Noah. That was very informative. And for those who don't know me, I'm Daniel Dre, Adamah New York's Climate Action Coordinator. Thanks everyone for attending. We're going to open up for Q&A now. So if you have any questions or want to know more about one of the topics that was discussed, please feel free to come off mute, introduce yourself, and ask your question. I can kick it off with one. Noah, you mentioned that the costs for connecting the community solar projects from the utilities were going up by 5x since 2020. Can you talk a bit more as to why that is? Is that a real cost increase? Is that utilities just jacking up the prices? What's going on there?
I'll say a little bit of both. You know, I'll talk first just about so one challenge that we have is this is just a totally unregulated um, thing where the utilities basically say what the cost is, and if you want to move forward with your project, you just have to pay it. And the Public Service Commission is charged with regulating our investor-owned utilities in New York State, but they're really not focusing on the costs of interconnecting clean energy resources. They're really focused on the things that are paid for um, by utility ratepayers in their bills. So I think for the regulator, it's just like it's not a major priority. So we definitely do see utilities padding their costs. And again, the utilities don't have a major incentive to manage their costs and get things built really cost effectively because like they they make the same money either way. And it's just as a general matter, the way that utilities work in um, it's not just New York, but the business model is that the more they spend, the more they make. So they don't have a strong incentive to bring their costs down. So that's a little bit of the challenge. But then there are also a bunch of things that are outside the control of the utility. Like we have seen inflation, we have seen the cost of like transformers and other things go up a lot. So that's a real piece of this. And I don't want to minimize that. And then the last piece is that in some respects, we're victims of our own success in New York. So the places where it was cheap and easy to plug in, there are already solar projects online in those places. And so now for the next project and the next project after that, folks are triggering more significant system upgrades. And so when we look at, you know, what can be done about this, what we're finding is that a lot of those upgrades are they're necessary if you're looking at them with a 20th century planning framework, which is actually how utilities do it. Like they're not the way that they approach integrating clean energy. It's that we're integrating 21st century technology with 20th century tools. And so really by embracing some of the smart grid controls and the things that we've had for the last 30 years, we can integrate clean energy projects a lot cheaper. And up until recently, there hasn't been a need. But now that the costs are going up and up and up, we need to start thinking, we need to start working smarter because it's getting to the point where individual solar project can't pay to like rebuild a whole substation, but it really doesn't need to. And if we put the right monitoring and controls in place, then we can just actively manage those solar projects and integrate like twice as much on our existing substations.
Awesome. Thanks so much for that. We're getting some questions in the chat, but I saw that Sam has his hand raised. So please go ahead, Sam, and ask your question.
Yeah, thank you. So my name is Sam Starr. I'm with Temple B'nai Torah in Wantagh, Long Island. And I have two questions, and I'm not sure they're necessarily related, but on the community solar, what's the impetus to get a community solar project going? I mean, is it the demand from individuals or institutions banding together? Do you need a developer to put the money in to put it together? How does it get started?
Yeah. Thanks, Sam. That's a great question. And the answer is it depends. There's like multiple pathways in. For a traditional solar developer, um, they're looking at building a community solar project as a way to generate revenue, right? And so a community solar project, basically they build a project and then they sell electricity to homeowners and to businesses, and they do it at a guaranteed discount is typically the model in New York State. So you know, for every dollar that a community solar project knocks off someone's bill, maybe they'll charge them 90 cents, for example. Like that's a pretty common model. So it's often developer driven, at least, you know, in upstate New York. I've definitely seen and been involved in successful examples of more kind of nonprofit and community driven projects where there's an organization that has a vision for a project and they want to build it so that they can deliver bill savings to, you know, maybe it's members of their community and like and that type of thing. You know, what I've seen that one of the challenges there is always about finding the right site and finding the right partners. So you know, if your temple has a facility where you could put solar on the roof, could you structure it as a community solar project? I mean, the answer is yes. And then it's a matter of finding the right partners to work with on that project. who will build it and manage it and make sure that everything works how it's supposed to. Um, but yeah, there's a lot of different reasons to do it. And from a policy perspective, I think the reason to do community solar as as a state is that it helps bring access to solar power to renters and to people who couldn't put it on their own roof because of the cost of a private installation. And also just a way to get bill savings to folks who really need it. And in New York, we have a lot of programs that steer those bill savings towards low income New Yorkers. And a lot of our community solar that's being built in the state is involved in those programs.
All right, now my second question goes to energy storage. At least in communities, certain communities on Long Island, uh, storage facilities have been either constructed or they want to construct them, but there's been significant community pushback. The old NIMBY problem, safety concerns. I think one actually had a fire. So I don't know if that's something that it's going to eventually improve, but it's nice to talk about it, but the communities really don't seem to want it, at least where I am.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Sam. And I think like a couple things. First, obviously, battery safety is critical, and we need to make sure that these systems are being installed in a smart, responsible way, and that local fire departments are given appropriate resources and support. And I think New York has done a really good job. Honestly, we adopted a state fire code that's really one of the most rigorous in the nation when it comes to energy storage, taking lessons learned from the city of New York and also experience with a couple of battery fires that occurred a couple years back. So I think that's it, it's a tough challenge to work through. We will work through it because communities don't want might not want batteries because it feels like maybe it's an unknown, it's a technology that they've read something negative about it. Um, but communities do want affordable, reliable power, and energy storage is going to be critical for that. And it already is. Like we see like multi-billion-dollar savings opportunities between New York City and Long Island, where like if we're not deploying energy storage, what we're doing is we're propping up fossil fuel peaker plants that are documented. It's documented that they cause like thousands of premature deaths per year in New York City alone, just from air pollution. Never mind the cost, the financial cost of keeping those things going and overbuilding our distribution system to distribute that power from centralized locations. So there are so many, and then with energy storage, like I know there's a lot of concern and fear, and I don't want to minimize any of that. I think like everyone has the right to be concerned about new technology and wanting to make sure it's done as responsibly as possible. But we've had zero fatalities or documented environmental harm from battery storage systems in New York State, and we cannot say the same thing about literally any other energy infrastructure. So I think a lot of this just comes down to like the devil you know versus the devil you don't know. And I expect that over time folks will get more comfortable with it because New York is really behind other states. I mean, we have not even just states. Like if you look around the world, like energy storage deployment in New York is lagging behind almost everywhere else. And it's one of those things that's like it's it's going to happen, and I think it's just a question of how to bring communities along and to make sure that folks are getting good answers to their questions and that local stakeholders and fire departments are getting the right resources.
Thank you.
And I can't quite figure out how to put my hand up, but it's related. And just for another minute before we go on to like nonprofits, which I think is also important, is can you just give us like a couple of examples of community solar that's actually been created in New York City and surrounding suburbs? And if you feel like there's a trend, what that is.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. So if we're talking about the New York City, kind of more the downstate region, I can talk from personal experience because I've developed a lot of community solar projects in New York City in partnership with nonprofits. Right. So one example maybe worth pointing at is the New York City Housing Authority has a program called Access Solar. And what they're doing is they're leasing out their rooftops of certain developments and solar companies are coming in and paying them an annual lease for using the real estate. And then they've embedded in their program requirements for hiring local residents and making sure that the utility bill savings are distributed first and foremost to NYCHA residents for the folks that pay their own Con Ed bill, but then also just more generally to low-income New Yorkers. So the Access Solar program is a neat one to look at. I was personally involved in a project that put solar on 40 rooftops in 3 different NYCHA developments between Harlem and South and Central Brooklyn. But there are a bunch of those. That's a cool one. There's the Brooklyn Army Terminal did a project called Sunset Park Solar. That's a neat one that was really kind of community driven, mission driven. Um, but those I would say are kind of like exceptions to the rule. Like most typically a community solar project is more of like a real estate transaction where there'll be like an owner of a warehouse or a large light industrial building in like Maspeth or something like that, and they'll be approached by a solar developer who will say, "Hey, you've got a great roof. I would love to lease your roof from you for this many thousands of dollars per year, and I'll give you discounted electricity." And that's like commonly how that works for the big commercial and industrial warehouses. And then for like a community institution, a lot of the time it just depends on like what structure would work. Kind of depends on the size of the building and where it's located. Um, but really that kind of model could work where you're doing like a roof lease and there's a community solar provider coming in. So it doesn't cost the building owner anything to do the project, but they're both advancing environmental goals and then generating revenue to support their operations.
Great. So we got a few questions in the chat. David asked about what innovative financing and partnership models can nonprofit organizations pursue to make solar energy projects economically viable now that there's an absence of the substantial incentive programs that were available on the city and state and federal level, and also the risks and benefits of any approaches.
Geez, that's a lot of questions, David. Um, uh, good questions. I mean, what financing partnership models can nonprofits pursue? I mean, historically, the challenge, and this is before the passage of uh, oh gosh, um, so pre-Biden, the challenge was that the nonprofits could not claim federal tax credits. Under the Biden administration, they changed that by creating a direct pay provision so that nonprofits could get the federal tax credit. And that still's true, actually, today. If you start a solar project today as a 501c3, you can get the federal, and historically, like, a nonprofit can't claim a tax credit because you don't have tax liability to offset. But the Treasury has a program where like they basically issue checks for the value of the tax credit. Um, and that still's on the books, although the federal tax credit is being phased out really quickly because of HR1. And so historically, to get that tax credit pre-Biden, there would be partnerships between for-profit companies that could claim the tax credits and nonprofits so that they could bring the benefits of those tax credits in. That's no longer necessary because a nonprofit can claim it directly. But with those tax credits phasing out, I think like it's more a question of like can organizations start their projects soon enough or finish their projects soon enough to qualify for those federal tax credits. And we're 1 month away from the deadline for starting construction to qualify for the tax credit. Either you need to start construction on a solar project by July 4th, or it needs to be fully installed and operational by the end of 2027 in order to qualify for the tax credit. So um, this is like, Trump era kind of phase out. There are these near-term deadlines to meet if you want to claim federal tax credit. So I think that's like more the thing. I'm curious, David, what you had in mind.
Well, I guess my approach would be is that the reality is that we're going to have to focus more on financing for these projects. similar purchase power agreements, and a variety of kinds of other tools. And there's probably a dozen of them out there, tax-exempt bond financing, philanthropic capital campaigns, which we've all done for other kinds of projects, green bank financing. I mean, I think there's solar leases. I think we're all going to have to get, schooled in those opportunities, because I think the reality is the incentives, at least during um, this period of political turmoil, incentives are not going to be there. And the bottom line is that if you haven't put a project into place, as you mentioned, is you're not going to get any incentives, or your small incentives. There's still some incentives from Con Edison, but you're going to have to look at some financing tools, as you would in any other kind of renovation project, including fundraising.
That's right. And what I would say also is that compared to any other thing that you might be raising money for, this one is a very clear return on investment. I think this is kind of, in general, just like solar is getting cheaper and electricity is getting more expensive. So that I think like you're absolutely right that the big challenge that I've seen working with nonprofits over my career who've tried to install solar, like the upfront cost was always the barrier, and then how you overcome that is kind of like either like you raise money somehow, or you finance it, which could be a lease, a power purchase agreement, or a loan. All potentially good options depending on the project. Um, but I think the fundamentals are that just like we're getting to a point where I think for a lot of buildings, like you can't really afford to not go solar, because the electricity rates are only going up. And if you think like, what can you do to protect your organization from that risk of prices going up and the volatility of prices going up over time? And it's really one of the few things where like you invest in it and then you've locked in lower costs for 25 years. Um, BR is
Well,
asking about the reliability benefits, like local reliability benefits of having a storage project in your community. Um, that's a really interesting question. I think the the resiliency benefits that an energy storage system can provide are like there are different types, right? So if you install a battery at a community facility, then it can basically provide like resiliency and backup power in the event of a blackout. That's a pretty cool application. If we're talking about batteries that are just connected to the distribution system, so they're either like a shipping container of batteries with a fence around it. That can provide it's less of an obvious direct resiliency benefit because it's not like when there's an outage you still have power, but there's like there's two things, like it's less likely that there will be an outage because you have that power stored locally that can power local loads during times of peak congestion, or in a contingency event where like a power plant goes offline, which happens, right? So like it's protective of the grid to have distributed energy resources, protective of a community to have more local energy. Um, so that's one piece of it. And then the other way that it's protective is really less about resiliency, much more about affordability, because what we see is like you can build a battery. Like when we think about how to serve growing demand for electricity, and the option is to like rebuild substations and put in new transmission, and it's just so expensive to do it, and it always gets done on the back of ratepayers. And so when we look at batteries and local deployment of batteries in comparison to that, and it's just like pennies on the dollar, it's like so much better for ratepayers. Um, but yeah, not the same kind of like resiliency benefit that you'd have like if you had a battery in your garage for a blackout.
Yeah, so I get that. But I guess, just thinking about dispatch, right? And thinking about how the grid operates, and I know it's really, really complicated. Um, there's no way that if you have one of these facilities in your community, that it's less likely that your community would experience a blackout than a community that didn't have one of these systems in proximity?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, I think that there's definitely applications for that, like more kind of like a microgrid, right? So you like the battery is intended for that use, where it's the purpose of it is to power a local community. And I think like you could certainly see that like in the context of like, I'm thinking about kind of like New York City major apartment developments where you might have like batteries in a parking lot and solar over the parking lot, and then the purpose of it is like to reduce demand for that like apartment development. And then, yeah, if there were a blackout, it could island for a period of time and stuff like that. I think I haven't seen applications where you have like a distribution connected battery that's like, injecting power during times of peak, but then could also um, serve a local load. But I also think that's the type of thing that I don't think it's impossible. And as more and more batteries get built, I think what it's going to do is it's going to build a lot more flexibility and optionality into the system. And so I'm personally of the mindset that what we need to be doing right now is deploying, and then there's going to be a big opportunity for optimizing these resources in the future too.
That's great. And we had one question from Richard Langer about a roadmap for an organization to, explore rooftop solar. I'll answer that one on behalf of Adamah. We have tons of resources online. You can download or resource guides, and you can also schedule time with me or our national team, and we can walk you through kind of a roadmap strategy, et cetera, and connect you with others who have done it. Yeah, so definitely take advantage of those resources.
And I'll plug in again our 250K zero interest loans, which is hard to compete with and are available for our community members. So at some point, I encourage you again to talk with Daniel if that's an option. Some have taken advantage of it. We've allocated over $2 million so far with those loans. So as Noah said, you can't compete with it. The return on investment is amazing, especially when you're not paying as much for your loan.
That's amazing. I've worked on so many solar projects over the years, and like you have to get so creative to figure out how to make projects economic. But 0% interest on a loan uh, changes that math a lot. Um, Pretty amazing.
Awesome. So I think on this positive note, we'll end. We'll send Noah's contact in our follow-up email to all of you if you have other questions for NYSEIA. And I want to thank you again, Noah, for taking the time and educating us. This was super informative. And thank you, Daniel, as always, for organizing and leading us in climate action and the coalition. Yeah, so thank you, everyone.
Thank you all. Great to meet you. Good to see you.
Thank you.
Thank you.